This is a list of the 10 books that I read most recently. Starting off not recently, I list when I start and finish a book in a notebook, and I would have intended to go through a few at a time but kept pushing it off, so now we're up to 10, dating back until the 1st of March when I started reading this, Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, Philip K. Dick. In this is the nice, these Gollancz masterworks, which I like, a very sort of, the sort of 90s feel to these prints. 2001. I've read a few Philip K. Dick now, not loads. What have I read? This is better than the one I read before, but I can't remember now what that was. But then it would be in this book, or at least it should be. Dick. Looking for my dick. Where's my dick? I don't know. It must have been longer ago than I kept this list, because this is a second list, and I had one before in a different book. It's a good angle. It's a good angle to have, the top of my head. Anyway, and I've not read any since, but I've got a few to get through. It would have been, I read 3 Stigmata, Do Androids Dream, Electric Sheep. I read Deuce Array with Zelazny. I like this one. I like this one very much. It was good. It's been a while since I read it. It follows the same thread that I think PKD is following through a lot of his books. It's just a similar cerebral dissociation from reality that plays out in the story. But this, I remember thinking that the like sub plot where you're following the policeman was very good and interesting. Not much to say about that. That's the first one. The next would be CJ Cherry's Hestia, and it's the first CJ Cherry that I've read, and I was drawn to reading something by her from some review of something I saw, and I wasn't disappointed. I really liked this. I thought it was very sort of simple or easy, not simple in a boring way, but just sort of easy reading. But then also it was quite often filled with quite nice prose, or just very descriptive of this place, and it reminded me of like Avatar, James Cameron's Avatar, which I really like, and then it similarly is like a planetary romance, which is not a genre I've read that much, but I don't think it would be similar to the older or original kinds of those stories, but sort of a more modern, it's not about a sort of bravado kind of heroic adventurer, but just like a very normal character being moved into a different world and confronted with a different race, or sort of like an Avatar. some people don't really like that. It reminded me, because I've not read that much science fiction by female authors, apart from Le Guin, but it did remind me of Le Guin in a way, in like the sensitivity to approaching the characters, which in a lot of fantasy and sci-fi you don't really find. If it's like an adventure or like a actiony, something like in Dick, the characters are very personal. You're getting into his characters' heads really deeply, but there's no sensitivity. They're not very sensitive characters. Whereas I found that hers were, and it seems a bit silly to only separate that off as like female authors are able to do that and male authors are not able to do that. But from a lot of other fiction and non-fiction that I've read by male and female writers, that tends to be, in my opinion, more common. But in terms of the story, I just really liked it. It's just quite straightforward, and easy reading. That's all I've got to say about that. The next one on the list is Vonda McIntyre, another female sci-fi author that I wanted to pick up and read because I'd was it this that I'd heard something about particularly. She's only written this, one other novel and short stories, and then some, I think, is it Vonda McIntyre that wrote Star Wars or Star Trek novels? I don't know, she's not written very much, but I absolutely love this. This is like, even more so, reminded me like Le Guin, also not just in the writing sensibilities, but the similarity of the worlds and the world building, like in the Earthsea books, and then also in her science fiction. But this is like sci fantasy. This is like what they call Jack Vance Dying Earth, sort of. It's like far future. It's like post future. It's like where the separation from now to time or space creates so much difference that it's more fantasy than it is just a fiction with whatever the cutting of like scientific unreality is that you mostly get. I would say I prefer probably science fiction books, which are more like science fantasy books. What I think a lot of people often call just planetary romance. There's a crossover there, but this is set on Earth, so you couldn't call it a planetary romance. They're more like describing a sort of romantic adventure novel. This is not that, but it is more fantasy than it is sci-fi, and all of the elements of technology, futuristic technology, which in this world is in the past, are like so well hidden and poke up so naturally throughout the story. And I love the way it starts and just completely throws you into this character, and this doesn't explain things to you, but you start to understand them as you go on. And then even far later into the book, you only start to piece the world together and how it works in parts and in really natural feeling, to me at least, ways that information flows into conversations and things. I just found the characters so lovable and likable, and I just found the world so comforting, and how it's obviously a more uncommon kind of protagonist, not just in being a female protagonist, but being a healer, not a doctor, but kind of a doctor, but a healer. And sort of this young woman who's extremely independent and capable and confident, and the world is, you know, not the safest, but it's also the ways that it's unsafe are not so much in the abundance of threats, but like the lack of threats. It's like loads of deserts are just sort of rambling through the desert, seeing nothing. There's just portions where they're journeying between places. It's just very calm and odd. The ending is a bit weird. It like goes off into a weird place, and there's a few things which maybe don't come off as well as they could, but I personally loved it, and I'm looking forward to reading her other novel, which is in the same world. I started reading it, actually. I read like one chapter. On to the next one. I read Brian M. Stableford, Face of Heaven, in April. I bought this in a bookshop, and the cover obviously drew me, and then the synopsis was just like, I was like, this is perfect. This is just really amazing. Like, I had to read it. Again, this is like a sci fantasy, and the setting is so perfectly odd and interesting. So, in a far distant future, a project of like, I think it's like millions of years, or, you know, hundreds of thousands of years maybe. It's like, this is like deep time stuff. I really like that in science fiction. I like time scales that are massively blown out of proportion, and seeing stuff shoot off. Like, it's interesting in a story if something happens and it unfolds. You know, in science fiction it'll be like some new thing, some strange thing, or in fantasy it's some magical thing comes in to take place, and that's interesting if a story unfolds, you know, over the course of a few days or weeks. But I just love a story that's telling about a thing happening over a really long scope of time. And in science fiction, especially in like space, that often makes more sense, and you end up with so much stories about like generational starships or things, instead of like space stories where you're faster than light travel or something, and you're able to go all over the universe to different planets and follow the course of like one character over not that much time. But the idea of something, the idea is set over a huge time scale, and these individual characters are, you know, throughout are going to be less interesting, but we're basically coming to this world at the end of an epoch, and this is in a future where the planet Earth has become so uninhabitable and ruined by humans that this massive plan for like complete solidarity by all the peoples on the world to use technology to free themselves from that by building a second layer on the Earth over all of the land mass, I think, but not all of the water, maybe. But it's basically like a you know, a raised platform, and goes around the whole world, and it has its own biosphere, and it, you know, and it can take nutrients out of the bottom still, but process them through machines to create a healthy biosphere, basically. But underneath that, there's a substratum, sort of surface of the earth, and then the sort of ceiling, which is the base of this dome, which is the new layer where they live. And when this is first formed, you know, we think, oh, all of humanity's moved onto this other layer, but actually there's been people left there, and there's been other creatures left there, and over this course of a really long time, new creatures have evolved under there. So you have this like alien world which exists underneath the human world, which has been in a sort of like semi-utopia for a ridiculous amount of time, and it's existing off of its own ego, in a way, being convinced that this huge unified project is the savior of humankind. They've remained in this like new world order. There's no countries or anything, there's no separate states, there's just the, you know, total governing body. But in reality, they are living above a totally different world, totally wild and ungoverned world of loads of different races and creatures, and yeah, it's just so much fun, and such like an imagination worm. You know, it reminds me of things that I was like imagining as a child, and like dreams and things. You just, you know, if you've got that demented streak in your mind where you can see a little rat man, you know, reminds me a bit of like Warhammer and things like the Skaven, and, you know, horrible versions of humanoid creatures that are in sort of like medieval settings of you know, fantasies. But then in this story, obviously, this is all coming to a head, and we follow a character on the surface world who's been having dreams about life on the bottom, and he's come out into the public, into the media, to share his dreams, and he's written a book in which he says this is basically, he's had revelations of the reality underneath their world is another world. People are like, what? There's no, you know, this is the world. There's no way there's anything living down there. But hundreds of thousands of years, there's, you know, there's no life down there. It's just, the world was destroyed, and we're using its resources. But he's had these dreams, and he's having really like real dreams. He's having premonitions. I can't really remember how it's explained that that's happening, but anyway, Brian Stableford is the first thing I read by him, and I loved his writing style as well. It's really funny, and it jumps back and forth between these two stories going on, and builds forward and forward, and each time you like get into the next bit of the story, you I think you're slightly like ahead of where you left off, so you constantly feel like you're chasing along. It's not a very long book, but it feels really dense. There's a lot of like little chapters and then slightly longer chapters. And there is a sequel to this, which I have, and I was really happy to get in like a collection of books in this edition. So I just bought a bundle of books and managed to get this. Like, I would have paid probably like a $5 to a $10, maybe. I might have been convinced on a certain day to pay too much for it, but it's definitely a £5-6 book. I bought much worse books that I wanted or would like much less in worse copies for £5, which I shouldn't have done, but this turned out quite cheap in a bundle, under £2, and it's just got the amazing illustrations like this one. Yeah, looking forward to reading it, and it's much bigger, so I am really excited to see what exactly happens, where it goes. I think this actually, maybe this has the first book in, and yeah, so this has the Face of Heaven in. This is the one that's the collection. So is it 3 books? It's 3 books. So this has this one in it, and then the next 2. But yeah, I'll be reading that probably soon. The rest of that. God, it's taking a really long time. Just for me though, isn't it? It's just for my enjoyment. Then I read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, because I'm reading these through with the Narnia book club I'm a part of. I like this one a lot more than The Magician's Apprentice. Really enjoyable. Classic Narnia stuff going on. Yeah, I'm glad we're reading it because I do quite like it. Don't want to say much more about it. Then I read Gary Kilworth, the first Gary Kilworth that I've read. Really great cover, in solitary, really cool sounding idea. When I heard about it, I think in a video probably, he is an interesting sounding guy. And then this book is just... yeah, this is like... I would really recommend this because I just think it's just great, and it's so good that it's kind of so short and feels really punchy, and that it goes through different stages and sections, but maybe it's not as complicated or like deep, you know, but I just found it to be really like profound in the way it puts forward what it's about in this also really great science fiction story. But it's basically like an alien invasion story, but done so differently, and you know, it's really, you know, what is invasion about? What is it for? And this like simply kind of posits it in the most understandable state for us, I think. It is about colonialism and about colonization, but how would that be least like how we know it to be? So what is an alien species gonna do if it colonizes a planet? And if we go a bit further into the future again and see where we end up, what does that make life like for humans on the planet? And life is not good, but also interestingly not that bad. It's like, it's weird. And then you get to the end and there's a twist, and this twist just confuses things again, but then also makes them make more sense. But then also it then flips around, which I just think was fantastic. And like, even as the twist is happening, you're like, oh, but, and then it does flip it on itself, and it's like satisfying but not satisfying. yeah, it's weird. It is weird because so basically humans are completely solitary. They're made by the alien invader to live completely on their own, mostly at sea. A lot of the sea is like mud flats, or at least, you know, a massive, like the channel between England and Europe is huge mud flats mostly. And the aliens have set up like these big towers that are like pinprick towers, where there's little rooms that people can stay in, you know, or they stay out at sea, you know, where there's a lot of islands at sea. There's people living on islands and archipelagos, and sailing around on boats, and they're kept apart, they're kept isolated by the aliens. They fly around in ships and, you know, keep everyone in check. They're only allowed together, is it once a year or once every few years? So mothers are allowed to raise children, one child at a time, male or female children, up to the age of like, it's like 12 or something, or like, you know, it's like young, and then they're you know, they're separated, or they're expected to like go off, but men are not allowed to raise the children or look after the children. The men are kept isolated from the women. They're not allowed to live in groups, and then when they go off at whatever certain age, once a year or something, they're allowed to have this mating, and they're brought together, or they're allowed to find each other, and yeah. So that's obviously weird and you know, but this character that we follow is thrust into this world because he's been kept and lived with the aliens as a kind of servant. So he understands the alien world, but he doesn't understand the human world that the aliens have created. He's thrust out there and he starts experiencing it. And yeah, the aliens are really cool. They're like these giant bird creatures. So they've terraformed the planet in certain ways to produce a better atmosphere and a better environment. And they grow their own food in these big, horrible algae farms. And yeah, it's just super interesting, and it's really well written, and the characters are really fun. I highly recommend it. I recommend it. And then I started a book. I read it a bit, and then I started and read Use of Weapons, Ian M. Banks. When was that? That's like end of April. Is that right? Yeah. Sometime in April, I think. No. Yeah. God, I don't know. Apparently I read this one in like 3 days. Just weird for me. Anyway, this is the first Ian Banks I read. Weirdly, like, hadn't been on my radar until quite recently. Well, like an author I would see in bookshops on shelves, or like vaguely heard of, along with like other sci-fi authors that always seemed in my mind like adult, or like too adult, or like a different kind of thing that I wasn't interested in, you know. I never saw these, but like ultra spacey, I thought. Ultra spacey, what does that mean? Like Alistair Reynolds' books, when they always have like a planet on the front, and I just thought, like, I'm not going to understand how to enjoy that. But yeah, I absolutely love this. The culture is so interesting, and the way that it is explained in the story is really interesting. Like, you're not spoon-fed anything. The characters are obviously great. His writing is amazing, and just great to read. And then cool in places, really cool, and combining like elements of different feeling genre within a sci-fi setting, and then spinning off later on in, you know, where the book eventually goes. He is this kind of, in some way, like a heroic character, but then he's also this anti-hero, probably, and just what it's got to say about the tendency of humans towards war and conflict and politics, and endless complications of trying to figure out how to live together and govern, played off against this, this sci-fi utopia of the culture. And I just really love this idea of going off all over to so many different planets and places where, humanity has travelled across to different planets, or there's different planets of different species as well, and like within that the culture is like separate. It's not like on Earth humans evolved so much technology that they went off into space and it's one unified thing that carries on, like in most stories like this. But it's that happened, but then there's branches and there's conflicts and there's new things set up, and somewhere the culture is formed out of whoever from whatever place. I think maybe if I read more of his novels, culture novels, I'll understand it a lot more. But after reading this one, just absolutely hooked, and I will definitely be reading more. And I just love the way it swaps and it follows the story in each chapter, and then interspersed is different chapters which pull together his story from the past. And you think you're moving maybe linearly in one direction, then you think maybe you're going in the wrong direction. They're like it's basically pulling back. So more recently to the narrative moving this way, we go into segments moving back this way, but then there's a bit of a mix-up, I think, later on. But that's just great. Then I read a Deathlands book, Deathlands Crater Lake. Really excited when I found a few of these. I'd heard about them, and it's really not the sort of thing that I read, or I have read, or I've tried to read, and I'm just so glad that I did, because it's just really fun, really easy to read, just like 80s action, cheesy, filled with some characters, unexpected segments of the story, and like things happening in the story. I would read more. Probably I would like to get the first one, which is really hard to get because it's two authors. It's a pseudonym, but there's two, and then I think the other guy fell ill, and this author, I can't remember his real name, wrote with his story, but combined with his friend. And then I think he passed away, and then I think he wrote a huge number of these on his own until it was eventually shared between multiple different authors and went on as a series for a long time. But I think it's these earlier ones which are probably the better ones and more worth reading. Pardon me, burping. Then I picked up this quite randomly. Don't Pick the Flowers by D.F. Jones, an author I haven't really heard anything about or seen his books reviewed or spoken about. And this is like a science fiction, very tenuously. This is more like disaster novel, speculation about something scientific, geology, I suppose. There is experimental drilling, and they drill into below the Earth's crust or the mantle or whatever. They burst a massive gas bubble. I don't know if this is real. This book's from like the 70s, the early 70s. So it probably is like the sort of thing which, like, God, it seems so real, that could definitely happen. And then it's just like, yeah, just this disaster unfolding. And to be honest, it probably disappointed me a bit that it never went into like exploring that to great extents. The really horrible idea is that if there's so much is nitrogen, so much nitrogen being released into the atmosphere that it is diluting the breathable air and making the amount of oxygen a lot less, so it becomes difficult to breathe. From San Francisco, West Coast, gas clouds moving into America and cities, so many people dying. And near the end of the book, disaster is fully fledged, and it's like millions and millions of people have died all over America and into different parts of the world. And it has knock-on effects for there is subsidence, or the earth is moving where the gas bubbles burst, and there's huge earthquakes, and then there's massive tidal waves and tsunamis. I would have liked it to go into pushing further into this horrible scenario where the atmosphere is unbreathable, but it just kind of happens in the background and you hear about it. The characters that we follow early on in the novel, he is a geologist or I don't know, something like that, and he was on he was on the ship where they did the drilling, and then goes on a sailing trip. They make some friends on a sailing boat. Anyway, the disaster starts to unfold. They come back, it's unfolding. They plan to leave on the boat to get away from America and get somewhere safe, and it just keeps following them. It does constantly, when it starts to get boring, maybe a little bit boring, when it's taking a break and progressing time on a bit, and it goes back into the action and they move on. It is always quite a good fun read. There's never not enough happening for long enough for it to become boring. And it's a bit smelly actually. The sailing element is just fun, satisfying, and then there's this weird it's getting into the relationship of this couple, and then there's another couple, and then there's just a weird filling out the story. Basically, it's like two books. Someone wanted to write D.F. Jones wanted to write a book about a weird love triangle on a sailing boat, which is quite interesting, and then this really cool and terrifying disaster about an unbreathable atmosphere and this pocket of gas leaking, and then the earth is collapsing. It could have gone different ways, but it ends up going another way. And then right at the end, what I really liked is when the dust kind of settles and the characters have to come back away from this kind of crazy adventure and face up to this disaster, the reality of life. And it just describes the state of America, and a lot of it's completely changed. A lot of cities are completely gone, just abandoned, because so many people died there. And the new state of governance, this emergency response, temporary way of governing, and that's another little bit where you're like, oh, that's really horrible actually. Being constantly in a state of emergency, so then life just becomes really shitty for the main character, and then it just kind of ends in that. There's no real comforting resolution. It's just it was bad, and that's it. Goodbye. The only resolution is that the characters decide to stay together. And then I'd started reading this. 40 minutes I've been talking for. That's insane. No one's going to watch this. It's just for me, talking to myself. I quite like it. Started reading this, and then came back again. Nausea by Sartre. It took me a while to really get into it, and then when I committed to it and read it properly, yeah, I really liked it. I really like the nausea, this description of someone's mind in such horrifyingly close detail, and it's kind of like, I suppose what he's describing is a struggle with, he has a philosophical struggle with like existentialism and realizing that he's filled with thoughts and ideas about the nature of the world around him, and it's terrifying. But he's also, you know, like literally struggling with what I suppose he was trying to describe without knowing, like anxiety. I feel like humongous, crippling amounts of anxiety and dissociation. I don't know if it's actually anywhere anyone said. Maybe if I looked into it a bit more, people would say that he was in some sort of psychosis or something. I don't really think that's true. I mean, I felt a vague sense of relation to the character in this kind of like isolated feeling of being wrapped up in concerns about what's going on around him, and feeling like he's sat there going mad, going, what the bloody hell is going on with all this stuff that people are doing? Why are people doing this? And you know, there were real obvious issues and concerns with the world around him, which he's then confronting with a sense of isolation and a paranoia that he is not normal, and the thoughts he's having and discovering are not normal, and that he can't help it, and he's losing control. And it just really gets into it in a lot of passages. Really gets into this mad sort of, you know, prose, and it's really beaty and musical, and it at times edges on this kind of like nihilistic existentialism where it's, you know, and then other times it's like a revelation, like an almost holy spiritual revelation of understanding that there's meaning to the world that needs some work to understand. Yeah, I think it's just got to be read, probably. It's just got to be read. If you're reading a lot of other things, similar things along that line, like Camus. I've read a few. Albert Camus. Is it Albert Camus? What do we say? Albert Camus. And things like, I also think William Burroughs that I've read. A lot of like the beats. The kind of this trope in a way of like the outcast, the kind of the poet or the writer as an outcast, as a fringe character. Obviously, a lot of music that would come later than this novel. This, you know, this is going to influence It's maybe like the foundation of, you know, the intellectual, the kind of pretentious young intellectual, you know, the loner sitting in the coffee shop, which I've probably played up to myself, and think lots of people have. And, you know, real characters that are real and genuine, but then also are sort of maybe a bit like, not shy, but, you know, have intrusive, or, you know, I'm thinking like Patti Smith being the real deal, but then also being not actually a larger than life character like she saw Dylan as in New York when she met him. You know, there's a weird there's something there, if my brain can wrap itself around it, but in not celebrities, but in just large characters and people. And at some point, probably in the 60s onwards, as art progressed, and, you know, the things that people were talking about and revealing as being good for art, and the artist kind of changed, you would call the character in this book, Antoine Roquentin, just a young artist. But he isn't ever thinking of himself that way. He's a writer, but he's not an artist. But then you know that so many people have read this and sort of idolized his struggle and his philosophy in the book as making him a good artist. Yeah, there's probably so much more to say, but I'm just talking to myself anyway, so I feel croaky. That's 10 books. Time to have some tea or something.